They were already chuckling that the old woodsman had built his house out of the woodpile, for no man with any sense in that country mortared split-stove wood into his walls and called it a winter's shelter. And here was Halvor Broughton, past 50 and land poor, spending the whole of an autumn not raising a proper sawn lumber house at all, but laying up a wall out of firewood, cutting the logged-off slash into short, even lengths, splitting and seasoning it, and setting the round ends crosswise in a deep bed of lime and sand mortar, log end by log end, until the walls of his house stood up like a woodpile a man had mortared solid and could not carry off to burn. In the autumn of 1883, on a logged-off 80 in the cut-over pine country of the far north of Wisconsin, where the great white pine had been cut clean off and hauled away, and the land left littered with limbwood and tops, Halvor built his walls of stovewood the slow old country way an old Swede had taught him in his logging years, while all around him the men who had prospered on the sawmills and the timberland chuckled at him in amused disbelief for a foolish old immigrant who mortared his firewood into a wall and would surely freeze in it before the deep of the winter. What none of them troubled to remember, and what the killing cold to come would teach them at a hard price to their fine, thin houses and their great wood piles, was that on that wind-raked northern edge of the lake country, the true enemy of a winter was never the fire a man could build, but the gale that clawed the heat back out of a thin house faster than any stove could pour it in, and that the deep, mortared, wind-tight wall of wood the old woodsman was laying up was the single most stubborn answer to that robbing wind that anyone in that country had ever devised. He had come on to that cut over 80 carrying an old country craft and very little else. He was a broad, slab-shouldered, weather-darkened man of about 55, born on a hard little farm in the fjord country of Norway, and come across the water as a young man to swing an axe in the great pine woods of the lakes. And he had spent the best of his strength in the logging camps of the north and knew the winters of that country the way other men knew their own dooryards. He had been a woodsman all his years, and, before the axe, a layer-up of stone and log in the old country, and he could read the set of a wall and the lay of a stick of wood the way few men could. The mortared stove wood wall he had learned as a young man from an old Swede in a camp far up the lake, who had raised his own snug shanty out of nothing but split cordwood and lime, and had wintered warm in it while better-paid men shivered in their sawn bunkhouses. Halvor shared his small place now with his wife, Merritt, a calm and capable woman of his own years who could make a warm and ordered home out of a single tight room, and with his younger brother, Rasmus, a quick, restless man near 40, who had grown half ashamed of the woodpile walls and hungered after the tall, bright rooms of the prosperous, and who would, before that winter was through, defend the mortared wall to any man in the settlement who would hear him. For Halvor knew one plain thing in his bones that the newly prosperous men around him had let themselves forget, because they had begun to measure a winter house by how tall and bright and fashionable it stood, and how great a stove it could feed, and not by what the house was truly asked to do. It was this, that on that wind-raked northern country, the thing that beats a man is not the still cold of a calm night, but the long, driving, robbing cold of a gale. The northwest wind that pours down off the big frozen lake in the country beyond it and searches out every crack and seam and thin place in a house, and drags the warmth straight through the wall and away into the dark, hour upon hour, so that no fire a man can build will feel a leaking house as fast as the wind can empty it. The answer, the only answer, is not a bigger stove, but a wall the wind cannot rob. And there is no better wall in a poor man's reach, in a country buried in cast-off firewood, than a deep one of split stove wood set solid in mortar. Lay up a wall 2 feet through of short log ends packed round with lime and sand, Halvor knew, and you have a wall the wind cannot find a way into, for there is no long seam in it, and no thin plank to whistle through, only wood and mortar a full arm's length deep, and the still air trapped in all that end-grain wood holds the heat where it is made, so that a small fire in a tight, thick-walled room warms it through, and the warmth stays. With the same fire in a tall, thin sawn house is snatched out through the walls by the gale as fast as it is made. Halvor had built his winter not on a great fire, but on a wall the wind could not rob, on wood packed solid against the cold, on the plain old craft of laying stove wood in mortar deep and tight and true, and a settlement called all of it foolishness. But knowing that a wind-tight wall beats a robbing gale is one thing, and laying up a whole house of mortared stove wood that will hold a family through a north woods winter is another, and every stage of it drew fresh amusement from the men raising their tall sawn houses. Through the whole of that autumn Halvor and Rasmus worked the wood. They went out into the slash the loggers had left and cut the limbwood and the tops into short even billets a little longer than a man's forearm, and split the thicker ones and stood them to season in long ricks until the ends checked and dried, and they burned lime and slaked it and mixed it with sand and a little sawdust into a stiff, pale mortar. Then, course by course, they laid the house up out of firewood, a bed of mortar, a row of split billets set crosswise, with their round ends facing out and in, the hearts of the wall packed solid with more mortar, and a filling of dry sawdust and lime down its middle, and another bed of mortar over that, and another row of stove wood, on and on. The round faces of the log ends stippling the rising wall like the end of a mortared woodpile. He set the window holes deep in the thickness of the wall and the one door tight in its frame, and kept the eaves low and the room small, and left the middle of every wall filled with dry, still air. It is slow, cold, sticky, unlovely work, all of it looking for all the world like a man mortaring his firewood into a fence, and the settlement's prosperous men chuckled in easy amusement at the old immigrant and his brother fussing over a wall of stove wood while the good building weather went by. He laid his wall deeper and tighter than any wall in the district. And only when the whole of it was up and packed and hard did he raise a plain, low roof over it and set a single small box stove inside. And when it was done, the house stood low and squat and strange at the edge of the settlement, a poor man's one room walled in mortared firewood, beside which the sawmill men's tall, bright houses looked like the very future itself. And it was exactly that. Its lowness and its strangeness and the whole odd autumn spent mortaring stove wood, that fixed the settlement's judgment of him past changing. The amusement had a leader, and his name was Gideon Thorne. Thorne was the man the settlement reckoned had done everything right. He had come into the cut-over early with a little money and a sharp eye, had dealt in timberland and cordwood contracts and a share of a sawmill down at the rail, and had grown prosperous while other men only grew tired. And with his new money he had raised the finest and tallest house in the settlement, a big square sawn lumber house of 2 full stories with bright tall windows and papered walls and a deep front porch. warmed by two fine black iron stoves that a hired man kept roaring, and a great high woodpile ranked along its side that a man could not see over, and a fine mercury thermometer in a polished case mounted with pride beside his front door. And it was Thorne, more than any other, who took the old man's mortared woodpile as a kind of affront. For it stood at the edge of the settlement as a plain daily reminder that a man could winter in that country without buying or building a single thing that Thorne now prized. No tall bright rooms, no fine iron stoves, no towering woodpile, and come through the cold in a squat little house whose very walls were the cast-off firewood the loggers had left to rot. That a man should winter up there and want none of what he had struck Thorne as backward and worse, as a poor example, and he made a show of the joke to every man who came to warm his hands at his fine stoves. The old Norwegian had mortared his winter's firewood into his walls, Thorne would say, and built his house out of the woodpile, and spent the best autumn years down in the mud and the wood chips so that he might live in one squat cold room the whole winter through and call it sense. And any man of standing built tall and bright and sawn now, and warmed himself at a proper stove the way prosperous men did. And the men warming their hands at his stoves would chuckle in comfortable agreement. And it went round the settlement, the backward old woodpile builder at the edge of the clearing who had mortared his firewood into a wall and would freeze for it before the deep of the winter. The strangest part of it, and the part Halvor could never quite make them feel, was that the proof of the whole thing was not some notion of his own, but the settled practice of hard-up men in the timber countries of the old world and the new, and the settlement looked straight past it only because it had lately taught itself to be a little ashamed of exactly that kind of thrift. In the poor forested corners of the old country and in more than one lake country camp, men who had firewood without end and sawn lumber deer had wintered warm behind walls of split cordwood laid in lime for longer than anyone could reckon, and had come through the hardest cold on almost no fuel. But the mills had come to the cut-over, and with them the money and the fashion. And the fashion said that a man of standing raised a tall, bright sawn house and warmed it with a great stove, the way prosperous men did down at the rail, and thought of a mortared woodpile wall as his grandfather's poverty. And so one of the soundest and most tested winter walls a poor man in a wooded country had ever devised had come to look, in that one settlement, in that one prosperous season, like the mark of a man who had failed. Halvor tried, once or twice, in his few slow words, to say that men had wintered warm behind mortared cordwood since before any of them were born, and the men heard the words and let them go, and chuckled at the one old immigrant who was doing the most sensible thing a poor man in that country could do. Halvor let them chuckle, for a settlement busy laughing leaves an old man in peace, and there was a winter to make ready for. Through the shortening days he and Rasmus tightened the little house and cured the fresh mortar with slow, easy fires and laid in what they needed, and slowly the younger man came round to the squat, warm room. For it is hard to keep being ashamed of a thing you sleep warm inside every night while the cold hardens outside. And the daily truth of it, once the deep cold set in, was the whole secret working in plain sight, had any of the amused men cared to look. There was almost no wood burned, only a small fire in the box stove, morning and evening, damped down low. A few sticks of the very stove wood the walls were made of, because a wall 2 feet through of wood and mortar barely lets the warmth out, and a small fire in a tight, thick-walled room is enough to hold it, while every tall house had a hired man feeding 2 great stoves by the hour all day and banking them against the night. Halvor ranked a woodpile so small the neighbors took it for the plainest proof yet that the old man did not grasp the winter he lived in, a fraction of the least pile in the district, because a house walled in mortared stove wood asked for a fire hardly worth the name. The prosperous men who passed the squat house and saw the little woodpile and the one thin thread of stove smoke at dusk were surer than ever that the old woodpile builder would be frozen out or begging a warm room before the turn of the year. By the first hard cold of that winter Halvor got his first true proof, though he was near the only man who marked it for what it was. A sharp cold came down one night on a rising northwest wind, the first real one of the season, the driving, robbing kind that pours down off the big frozen lake and leans on every house it finds, and through the long hours of the dark it searched out every seam in the settlement. In the gray of the morning the tall houses were miserable. The two fine stoves in every fashionable house, roaring so bravely at supper, had warmed only the air of their tall, bright rooms, and the gale had dragged that warmth out through the plank walls and the window seams and the papered corners all night as fast as the iron could pour it back, and by the small hours the stoves, for all the wood shoveled into them, could not gain on the wind, and the tall rooms stood by dawn cruelly cold in every corner the gale could reach, and their people rose stiff and short-tempered to build the fires up again with hands that would hardly close. That was the plain price of the great stove in the tall, thin house against a driving wind, and every fashionable house in the settlement paid something of it that morning. Halvor and Rasmus did not. They had let their small fire burn down at bedtime to a few red coals in the box stove, and the deep mortared walls had given the gale nothing to take, no seam to whistle through, no thin plank to pull the heat across, and they had lain down warm and slept the night through in a room that never went cold. And when Halvor rose in the black before the dawn and laid the flat of his bare hand on the inner face of the stove-wood wall, the wood was mild to the touch, and the little room was as easy as an autumn evening, with hardly a coal alive in the stove. He built the small fire up again, only to boil the coffee and take the chill edge off the room, and marked, as he had every winter of his life, that the wall had held. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a place who still trusts an old true thing, and Halvor had lived inside it since the first course of stove wood went down in the mortar, though he bore it more easily than most, for his faith was not truly his alone, it was only alone in that one settlement, in that one prosperous season. On the hard windy nights of that early winter he would sit late by the cooling stove, with the thick walls holding the day's warmth close around him, and go over the whole of it again the way a careful man checks a thing he has staked the winter upon. There was no one in the clearing to grant it a grain of sense. There was only the knowledge the poor timbermen of two countries had carried down the years, and on the cold nights that knowledge was the only voice in the settlement that agreed with him. Every man he could speak to now believed the loud and shining thing. That warmth lay in the tallest house and the greatest stove and the highest woodpile a man could raise. The quiet thing, the warmth held behind a deep wall of mortared firewood that gave the wind nothing to take, he alone believed at that clearing. He, and the old thrifty timbermen of the old world, and the new, and the old Swede who had taught him the wall in a camp long ago, and had kept warm behind the like of it to the end of a long life. He had chosen long before which of the two he would trust when the winter came to settle the question, and he trusted it now, and slept warm on it while the cold hardened outside. The killing winter came at the deep of the year, And it came as that country's own particular danger, the great cold on the wind, the long driving Arctic freeze that pours down off the frozen heart of the continent and the ice of the big lake and settles in and will not lift. It did not come still and calm, it came as a hard, high, howling cold. A northwest gale that rose on the first evening and never once let go, driving a bitter, dry cold before it that deepened at every dawn, day after day after day. The wind screaming in the bare timber, and the loose snow streaming off the drifts in long white ropes, and the very air turned to a blade that no coat could altogether stop. For 8 days that driving, killing cold lay on the cutover and did not break, hardening at every dawn, the whole country shut up indoors and simply trying to keep the wind out. The fine mercury thermometer beside Thorne's proud door fell past 20 below and past 30, and the government's weather observer at the rail depot, reading his own official register in the shriek of the gale, set it down at 44 degrees below zero on the worst and wildest of those mornings, colder, driven on that wind. Then the oldest man in the settlement could remember the cutover going, in a country that was learning dawn by killing dawn, exactly what its tall, bright rooms and its fine iron stoves and its towering wood piles were truly worth against a wind that long and a cold that deep. 44 below and 8 days of it on a wind that never fell, each dawn harder and drier and crueler than the last. At such a cold, driven so long, the whole comfortable arithmetic of the tall, bright house came apart. The 2 fine stoves the settlement had been so proud of warmed the air of the tall rooms and no more, and a savage, steady gale dragged that warmth out through the plank walls and the tall windows and the papered seams faster than any iron could pour it back. And no stove alive. However a man stoked it, could gain against a wind that pressed on every thin wall at once, so that whatever warmth the fires won at the stove front was gone a pace away, and the tall rooms crashed cold in every corner. No woodpile, however high a man had ranked it in the golden autumn, stood tall enough when both stoves must be fed all day and half the night merely to keep one inner room short of freezing. The prosperous men gave up the far rooms and the upper stories of their fine houses to the frost, crowded their households into one downstairs room around the stoves, sat up in shifts to feed them, and watched their great woodpiles go down with a growing and private dread. Out at the edge of the settlement, in the squat one-room house whose walls were the mortared woodpile the whole district had laughed at, Halvor and Merritt and Rasmus were warm. They were not merely getting through it, they were warm, plainly, steadily, undeniably warm. And they held so through the first howling, killing night of the great cold, and the second and the third, and did not fail. Each morning and each evening Halvor lit a small fire in the box stove and let it burn a while, and then damped it low, and the deep walls of wood and mortar simply would not let that warmth go. The gale screamed and clawed at the squat house all night and found no seam to enter and no thin plank to pull the heat through. Only 2 feet of solid stove wood and lime that it could neither get into nor drag the warmth across. There the mortared wall did exactly what the poor timbermen of 2 countries had built its like to do. While the settlement sat up in shifts feeding 2 great stoves apiece and losing, the 3 in the squat house slept whole nights through in a mild and easy room, and their little heap of stove wood went down so slowly it was scarcely worth the name of burning. Halvor had carried a small brass thermometer for years, bought long ago from a peddler at the rail, and he had hung it on the inner face of the stove wood wall at the height of a sitting man's head. on the worst black morning of the whole 8-day freeze. The morning the observer's official register down at the depot and Thorne's fine glass beside his fine door both set the cold at 44 below on the screaming wind, Halvor woke in the mild dark of his squat house and looked at it. The needle on the wall stood at 64 degrees above zero, easy as an autumn afternoon inside a poor man's one room, with a cold outside that stood the glass at 44 below and would have overcome an unsheltered man before the dawn. A gulf of 108 degrees held across nothing in this world but a deep wall of mortared stove wood packed solid and tight against the robbing wind, and the plain good sense to have built the winter's warmth into the very walls where the gale could not get at it. The box stove in the corner held only a few low coals from the night, and yet the inner face of the wall was mild to his bare palm from end to end, and Merritt and Rasmus slept easy across the room, no nearer the killing cold than they had been in September. Halvor looked a while at the needle, then laid the flat of his old hand on the warm inner face of the wall the way he had done every hard morning of the life that mattered, and rose to build the small fire up enough to boil the morning coffee. Down among the settlement's tall houses, the reckoning had come to Gideon Thorne. His big square sawn house drank its great woodpile at 44 below the way a tall thin house full of leaking seams must, and by the 6th day of the great cold, with the upper story and the far rooms long surrendered to the frost, his household crowded into one downstairs room. And his own high woodpile burned frighteningly low, the prosperous man made a poor morning's judgment. He wrapped himself and set out on foot across the frozen clearing toward the rail, where there was said to be cordwood to be had and a warm depot stove. A walk of no great distance that he had made 100 times in easy weather. But a man's judgment is a poor guide in a driving cold, where the savage wind takes the warmth out of a body faster than the body can make it. The killing gale got into him within a few hundred paces, took the surety out of his hands and then the strength out of his legs, and a numbing dullness came over his thinking, so that the short familiar way seemed to turn and lengthen and lose itself in the streaming snow, and he could no longer be sure which way the rail lay nor which way his own fine house. He blundered on across the hard blue dusk with the wind flaying him, the cold climbing his arms, and the one thing he could at last make out clear in all that shrieking failing light was a low, warm glow at the edge of the clearing, a soft amber light bleeding round a low door and a single deep-set window. The woodpile house he had laughed at from his own fine porch all the autumn long, warm and lit and steady at the frozen edge of the fields. He came to the low door and beat on it with a hand he could no longer feel, and the door drew back, and the held warmth of the deep-walled room rolled out over him into the killing wind like something solid a man could lean his whole weight against. And Halvor's old hands took hold of him and drew him in over the low threshold and shut the great cold out behind him. They laid him close by the box stove against the inner face of the stove wood wall in the warmest corner of the little room and worked the warmth back into him slowly, the way you must, Rasmus chafing his numb white hands and Merritt getting hot coffee into him while the deep wall gave up its mild, steady warmth beside him. And the fierce pain of the thawing came on and told him he would keep his fingers. And it was while he lay there, warmed in a squat little room, with the worst wind-driven cold in memory howling 44 below a wall's thickness away, that Thorn looked about for the two great roaring stoves that surely must be making such a heat, and found none. There was no great stove and no great fire, only the one small box stove in the corner, with a few low coals in it, damped down to almost nothing, and around him on every side 2 feet of mortared stove wood holding the warmth in against a screaming gale. He laid his thawing hand flat on the warm inner face of the wall beside him and felt the solid, wind-tight, wood-deep warmth of it. And he was quiet a long while, a loud man gone wholly silent, understanding at last exactly what it was he had been laughing at all the autumn through. "There is no great fire in it," he said at last, low, as if it were a thing he could not make sit right in his head. "You are keeping warm at 44 below, an old man and his wife and his brother, on a wall of stove wood and a fire the size of a coffee pot, and I have burned a whole winter's woodpile and sat up 6 nights and am driven out of my own fine rooms." Halvor told him only that the wind cannot get through wood and mortar the way it gets through a plank seam, and that a thick wall holds a small fire's warmth where a thin one lets it go, and that the old Swede who had taught him had kept warm behind a wall no better than this one to the end of a long life, and Thorn, with the painful heat coming back into his hands, said lower still that he had been a loud fool about the old man and the mortared wall alike, and had said things from his own fine porch he had no business ever to have said. And Halvor, who had no gloating anywhere in him, told him to lie nearer the corner where the wall ran warmest, for there was warmth enough behind mortared stove wood for a rich fool as well as for a poor wise one. He kept Thorn by the warm wall through the worst of it, and sent him home in a milder lull 3 days on, wrapped and braced on Rasmus's arm with a heated stone carried in his coat, and before the great cold at last broke, 2 households from a wind-raked stretch at the open end of the settlement, their stoves eating the last of their wood, made their way to the squat house on the word that there was steady warmth in it, and the one small room walled in mortared firewood that had been built for 3 held them all and stayed warm through the whole of it on the same small stove, because the warmth was not in any great blaze that could be burned down, but in the deep wind-tight wall, which gave the long gale nothing it could take. When the great cold at last let go on the 9th day, and a low hard sun came up over a silent blue-white cutover, the people who came out of Halvor's squat house came out warm and whole, and every one of them well, into a settlement that had shivered behind its tall, bright walls, and burned its great wood piles down to chips, and very nearly lost its fine rooms to the frost. And the prosperous men of that clearing did not chuckle about the woodpile house any more, Thorn least of all. He went back to his tall, cold house a changed man, and in the spring, quietly with no one by to see him do it, he came out to the squat house and asked the old man to show him how the stove wood was laid and how the mortar was packed so that a wall would give a winter gale nothing to take, and Halvor showed him the whole of it, as the old Swede had shown him 40 winters before. A few of the poorer families of the settlement, the ones who had come nearest to ruin behind their fashionable walls, tore out their thin-sawn partitions that summer and laid up mortared stove wood instead, deep and tight and true, and blessed the old craft ever after. Most did not, for a man's pride in the height and brightness of his house runs deeper, very often, than his memory of one hard winter. But the story of that great cold, the 8 howling days and the 44 below on the wind, when the tall, fine houses very nearly failed their people and burned out their wood piles, and the old man they had laughed at came through it warm at 64 above on a fire the size of a coffee pot. With a thawed mocker in the warm corner of his one room and no great fire burning anywhere in it, was told up and down the cutover for as long as there was anyone in that settlement to tell it. They had called it foolishness, the firewood mortared into a wall right up until the winter came and asked its one hard question, not whether a man could build a great fire, but whether the warmth he had made could be kept against a wind that would not fall, and a great stove in a tall, thin room had no answer to give, while a deep wall of mortared stove wood answered it all the 8 howling days long. As they said on that cutover ever after, build the wall the wind cannot rob, for a fire only warms while it burns, but a good wall keeps what the fire gives long after. Pack the cold out with what the world throws away, for there was a whole winter's shelter in the woodpile the proud men left to rot, and never measure a house by the fire it can burn, but by the cold it can shut out when the wind will not lie down.